before we move on with this afternoon's topics, is there any questions from discussion group anyone would like to bring up?
You were wondering what is mindfulness? Is awareness a byproduct of mindfulness? What is mindfulness?
On the first evening, I think I briefly mentioned mindfulness, and we'll talk more about that in a couple of days' time, in a bit more detail. But this word mindfulness, in the Buddhist context, is coming from the Sanskrit term smrti, or the Pali word sati. And both of those words literally mean memory, to remember. And so basically, mindfulness is our ability to remember the object. In other words, our ability to hold the object without becoming distracted. And it's often defined as something like the faculty of sustaining voluntary attention continuously upon a familiar object without forgetfulness or distraction. And I think, as I mentioned earlier as well, what we need to be aware of is that in a lot of modern day mindfulness traditions, they've redefined that word to mean something different. And often in the modern traditions, it's defined as something like a non-judgmental awareness of whatever is arising in the present moment. Of course, that's a very good thing to do, but that's not how the word was originally defined. So we need to be aware of the different usage of that word, otherwise we just get confused. But here in Buddhism, it's really our ability to hold the object. And if we can strengthen mindfulness, it means we can improve our attention skills, our concentration, our ability to focus. Any other questions? Yeah, another one.
How do we verify the idea of rebirth?
How do we, what, sorry?
How do we verify?
Verify the idea of rebirth. Some people claim to have past life memories, and in fact, quite some years ago, there was a scientist called Ian Stevenson who was in the University, I think, of Virginia, decided to check that using scientific method. And I believe he originally wanted to disprove it and wanted to show that all of these memories were we could be explained in other ways. And many of the people who claimed to have past life memories were often young children. And so he tested and checked a lot of them. And many of them you could discount and say, well, that doesn't show anything. But there were certainly a number of cases where he found that these children had memories that would be very difficult to explain apart from some idea of some rebirth. That they had memories of their past life that they explained in terms of places and people and things and so forth that would be very difficult to have apart from some idea like that. So basically, in the end, he came up with a number of cases where it seemed to really indicate the idea of rebirth. Of course, does that prove it? No, but it certainly is evidence that would suggest that, because otherwise it would be difficult, I think, maybe not impossible, but it would be very difficult to explain how they could have these memories otherwise. And of course, the Buddhist assertion is that that all of our memories from past lives are there, and we can gain access to them through this shamatha practice. That by developing a high level of concentration called jhana, that if we develop that level, our mind is very clear and focused, we can start to tap into those memories, and then from our own experience we can validate that.
But then are there cases where people remember past lives that aren't human?
Are there cases?
Yeah.
Possibly, but actually if we thought about it, if the past life wasn't human and the memory was from another type of being, as a human, I think it would be difficult to connect to that memory. It would be very difficult, I think. In fact, even in these cases with the young children, what they found was often when they reached teenage years, they lost that ability. And I think the reason is that as a young child, they're not so much entrenched in this life and this body, so it's easier to connect to those memories. But once we really establish our identity as this life and this body and this world, then that to connect to those memories becomes more difficult. And what they found is often those children, by teenage years, they lose that ability. And that many of them were young children who had that. And I think that's the reason, is that they're not so caught up in this body and this life that they can access that.
But which type of memories these children could have? How do they...
Well, they explained who their parents were, what the house they lived in, what described very detailed descriptions of the place they lived in. It sometimes was in a completely different country they've never been. And then they would ask those people questions about that child, and then they would ask them, what was that? What was this? And so it was he did it in a very empirical way to try to discount, to show that maybe he was just making it up, so there was very precise questioning going on. And we'll leave it there.
Is it true that often people are reborn in the same family, or like maybe your grandmother could be your child?
Yeah, that's... we're going to sort of cover this a little bit coming up, but the short answer is, actually you see that written sometimes in the text. Because again, it's, I mentioned briefly already that when we're going through the death process, one imprint ripens to determine where we go. But of course, all the imprints that we deposit through our actions is with respect to places and people and so forth. So it's said that if we have a very strong connection with certain place or certain family or people or society, that if the conditions allow, we would be reborn there. So sometimes you do. You see in the text where the grandfather was born as the grandchild, for example. Yeah.
What about simultaneous incarnation?
Simultaneous
Incarnation.
What do you mean by simultaneous?
That you could be incarnated like me, and then I could be someone else in this room or someone else elsewhere.
For a normal person, that's not possible.
Okay.
If you enlighten, that's a different story, but then we have to explain something else first. But there's only a single stream of consciousness, so for a normal person, you can't split that into two. That's not possible.
Okay, when we were discussing rebirth, we started discussing enlightenment, right? And it came to our group like, okay, so if you can attain enlightenment,
What happens next?
and do you get it when you're alive or when you're dead?
Yeah, well, that's coming. It's coming. I'll answer that.
We kind of discussed that. If people get enlightened, then does that mean there are less minds in the world, or how you can kind of count it?
Yeah, that's also going to be answered.
I've always found this perspective of rebirth and reincarnation to be quite narrow-minded. If the universe as we know it is infinite and the soul or mind is limitless, like why would we keep coming back to this earth?
This particular earth,
Right.
because we have a connection with this, so everything's interdependent. So these imprints, we're not doing actions in isolation, we're doing actions with respect to other people and with respect to certain places, and so that's part of that. And so but having said that, the Buddhist assertion is if suddenly this planet exploded, then we'd end up in other places, in other galaxies, in other realms. And that's one of the topics we're going to cover this afternoon.
That creates a bit of our own universe.
Sorry?
It creates a bit of our own universe, that this earth is all that is.
Well, Buddhism never says that.
Right, that's why it's always confused me.
Yeah, well, again, it's just because of familiarity. It's just because this is what we're familiar with and that we gravitate there. But it's possible that when we end up in some other galaxy, sure, of course. It's possible.
How will be the relationship between the karma and the awareness of our very present moment.
The relationship between karma and...
Yeah, to be aware of our present moment or our now. In the way, like we were discussing about if we do in relationship to karma, that we do things like now because like we want good for the others, or because we want like good karma for our next life.
Ah, you mean you're talking about what is our motivation to do things in the moment?
Yeah, we struggle with this thing, like to be aware and do good things to people, like in the very present. But then we have like the karma that is in the next life.
Ah, but I remember I said that if we do an action now, there are 4 possibilities when that ripens. One is soon in this life. The next one is in the next life. The third option is sometime in the distant future. And the fourth option, it never ripens because we've purified it. So it's not like everything we do now only ripens in the next life. That's not true.
Oh, okay.
In fact, if we do things now with a very strong motivation, that can ripen very quickly.
I didn't have that present, thank you.
Okay, so let's sort of continue on where we left off. So we were talking about the death process, and we said that we can go through these 8 stages. The first 4 stages, this coarse body is slowly shutting down. Therefore, the coarse mind, which is the mind that's active now, which is supported on this coarse body, will be shutting down. So by the end of the 4th stage, this coarse body is shut down, no breathing, brain activity finished. So therefore this coarse mind that's active now shuts down. But then over the next 3 stages, the subtle body is shutting down. All these subtle energies are withdrawing slowly into the central channel, coming to the heart chakra. And at the end of the 7th stage, then that subtle body is shut down, which means the subtle mind, which is supported on that, to shut down. And in the last stage, we have this very subtle, called clear light mind of death, becomes active, manifest. And if we are prepared for that process by developing the ability to maintain mindfulness throughout the process, when that happens, and that happens naturally, then we can stay here and meditate. And as I said, in a best case scenario, we can achieve enlightenment right here. If not, at least we can accelerate the path and develop the ability to navigate through the next stage of the path. And what I said was that as we're going through this death process, one karmic imprint gets activated, which will determine the next life. But when, at this point, this very subtle mind and body disconnect from this body, we first enter into what's called the intermediate period. In Tibetan, it's called bardo. Bardo literally means intermediate, in between. So the bardo is a state in between this life and the next. And what happens there is that this very subtle mind and body take on a subtle body, subtle mind. So in this state, we become what's called a bardo being. So it's a being with a very subtle body and subtle mind. And because it's a subtle body and subtle mind, this bardo being has a lot of capacity of the mind. So much so that it's said that that bardo being can actually see everything where they were in the previous lives. They can be in the same place and see everything that's going on. Even it's sometimes said that to the point where the bardo being doesn't realise they've actually died and they're in the bardo, and so they're there and they're wondering why no one's talking to them or no one seems to be communicating with them. But at some point they'll realise that they're in the bardo, and then in that state they'll try to find situations to satisfy this imprint that was activated in the death process. And let's say the imprint that was activated is going to determine that we're going to be a human again in the next life. Then part of this, the conditions that the Bardo being is looking for is that there is a sperm fertilizing the egg. And then if that's a suitable condition, then the mind of that Bardo being connects with that fertilized egg in the womb, and then the new life begins. So in fact what we find is that in many Buddhist countries, when someone's born, they're actually considered to be 1 year old, because for Buddhists the point of birth is actually conception. The new life begins at the time of conception. How long we spend in this Bardo state, in the Tibetan tradition we often see an explanation that it says it's a maximum of 49 days. But what that really means, does that mean 49 days from our perspective, or 49 days from the perspective of the Bardo being? Because for what us in the human world may seem to be like 1 day, that Bardo being may experience that as 100 years or 1 second. So their perception of time, of course, science has proven there's no fixed objective time. So the experience of time is very different there than in the human world. But what we do find is that in Tibetan culture, that often if someone passes away, you'll find that for up to 49 days they do these pujas and rituals in a hope of having a positive impact on the Bardo being for that time. So you do find that in the Tibetan culture. So then, where can we end up in the next life? And some traditions say that we're always going to be human. Some traditions say that we're always improving, better and better and better. Of course, the Buddhist assertion is that where we end up is dependent on how we lead our lives. And if we lead a good life, not trying to harm others, we'll end up in a good place. If we do a very harmful life, then we'll end up in not such a good place. What they look like is we're going to explain now using this diagram here as a basis on page 22, the Bhava Chakra called the Wheel of Life. But before we do that, I'd just like to read a little bit from this book called Tibetan Buddhism from the Ground Up from Alan Wallace, who describes a little bit this Bardo process. He says the following. What does this theory say about death, which each of us experiences? It says that death provides us no exit from the joys and sorrows, delights and tribulations of existence. During the death process, the body loses its ability to support human consciousness. The various sensory faculties, emotions and thoughts retract into a dormant state, and a more simple, unmodified state of awareness emerges. When consciousness is thus reduced to its primordial state, free of conceptualization, so now he's talking about this clear light of death, there may occur a transcendent experience of ultimate reality if one is properly prepared for this event. Otherwise, one merely experiences a brief sense of spaciousness that is rapidly eclipsed by various types of visionary experience. At death, the stream of awareness that departs from the body is no longer human, though it does carry a vast array of latent impressions from the just ended life as well as from earlier lives. These impressions are responsible for the type of experiences one undergoes during the intermediate period following death and prior to the next life. When this phase is over, if one is about to take another human rebirth, the stream of consciousness conjoins with the regenerative substances of one's parents either during or after they join in sexual union and conception takes place. During the development of the fetus, that awareness takes on the functions and attributes of human consciousness, namely the latent impressions of human emotions, thinking and so on are activated. These three phases, death, intermediate period and conception, are similar to the three stages of deep sleep, dreaming and waking. Understanding this, Tibetan contemplatives take full advantage of these states occurring during the sleeping process by practicing techniques such as dream yoga and other meditations in which awareness is gradually retracted as it is during the death process. In these practices, great emphasis is placed on experiencing the state of clear light or primordial awareness, which ordinarily manifests just before death. There are tremendous advantages to this achievement because it helps the yogi overcome mental afflictions and obscurations, and it leads to the ability to choose one's next rebirth at will. Buddhists believe that the type of death, intermediate period and rebirth we experience is determined by the way we lead our lives. Each act we perform leaves impressions upon our mind streams. Unwholesome deeds lead to suffering, wholesome acts lead to happiness and fulfillment. At death, the mental continuum that has been deeply cultivated by spiritual practice generally begins the next rebirth endowed with a comparable degree of spiritual maturity. So it is that the path of Dharma continues from lifetime to lifetime and culminates in the perfection of complete spiritual awakening, in which one is irrevocably released from all afflictions and obscurations. So, what we've said then is that we're stuck in this state of dukkha due to our mental afflictions, particularly our distorted view of reality, this grasping to the independent world. But we're not just stuck in this state in this life, we're stuck in this state life after life after life. And this cycling in this state of dukkha is called samsara. So samsara, of course, is a Sanskrit term. Sam is a prefix meaning fully or thoroughly. And sara is coming from the root sir, which means to go. So samsara is to fully go. It means to fully go round and round and round, to continue to go round and round. So samsara is often translated into English as cyclic existence. That we're cycling life after life in this state of dukkha. So actually samsara is not a place. This is not samsara. Samsara is a state of mind. If our mind is contaminated with the mental afflictions, we are stuck in samsara. When we eliminate those mental afflictions from the mind, we go beyond samsara, we achieve the goal of nirvana. So nirvana is also not a place. It's not like we disappear in a puff of smoke and end up on some cloud over the back of the hill there. Nirvana is a state of mind. So if we've eliminated all mental afflictions from our mind, we are in a state of nirvana. Same place. So samsara and nirvana are states of mind, they're not places. We don't end up in some alternate reality somewhere else. And here, this cycling, life after life, there's three terms here that are used. The first term that we see is rebirth. And rebirth implies that we have no ability to choose. that we're just simply cycling. Where we end up is completely determined by what we do in this life. We have no ability to choose. It's not like at the end of our life we can say, well, I think I'd like to end up there. We don't have that ability. So that's called rebirth. Where we end up is completely determined by what we do with our life. But then as we move along the spiritual path and start to purify the mind and start to gain some ability of the mind, then we start to have a little bit of an ability to navigate through the death rebirth process and navigate a bit where we want to go. That is called reincarnation. So reincarnation implies some ability to navigate through that process. And then we have another term, emanation. And that is if we have achieved enlightenment. Again, if we achieve enlightenment now, it's not like we disappear in a puff of smoke and end up somewhere else. We're still here. But then, because we've achieved enlightenment, we're no longer in samsara, then we're not caught up in this process. But we can continue to come and appear in the world again and again to help others. And so that process is called emanation. So both rebirth and reincarnation is if we're still stuck in samsara. Rebirth is we have no control. Reincarnation is when we've reached a certain level of the path, purified the mind, we have some ability to navigate, but we're still stuck in samsara. And then when we go beyond that, then it's called emanation. So they're the three terms that are used.
If you were to reach emanation and choose to come back, if you were
Enlightened?
yeah, back and you chose to come back to different levels, would you be aware of that or not?
Yes, yes.
And
If you have the thought, am I enlightened? That's 100% proof you're not.
is that what bodhisattvas are?
So bodhisattvas, and we're going to look at this tomorrow, the short answer is a bodhisattva, particularly a higher level bodhisattva, will probably be able to do this, but they're still in samsara. So the term actually, at a high level, bodhisattvas, before they become enlightened, go beyond samsara, but they still haven't got to enlightenment yet. When a bodhisattva, and we'll look at this tomorrow, when a bodhisattva achieves enlightenment, they're called Buddha.
When you reincarnate, it has to be linear, so you have to be subsequent to the life that you just
In
left.
time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even if you emanate?
I mean, here, now we're getting into some deep territory. If we keep it very simple, we say yes. But if we go down to this very subtle mind, which is the context of Tantra, then at that level, of course, we're beyond time. That's beyond time. So then we have to be careful how we phrase things. But if we leave that out for now, then yes, still linear in that sense.
What about liberation? Is it then also still in the incarnation?
Yeah, so liberation means we're liberated from samsara, so it wouldn't be that.
The second reincarnation, you can choose your next life.
Yeah, you can navigate through the death rebirth process.
You choose.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, but you have to have quite a high level to be able to do that. We can't do that now.
So reincarnation, that would be what the Dalai Lama is doing, right?
Well, okay, Dalai Lama. If you ask pretty well all Tibetans, they would say he's the Buddha of compassion, which means he's doing this, if he really is. If you ask the Dalai Lama, he'll say, I'm just a simple Buddhist monk who can't even meditate very well. So somewhere in between there.
My question is actually about the emanation bit, because there's the whole question about the Dalai Lama being reincarnated or not due to the circumstances. And someone said that there's the possibility of emanation, meaning that he would choose the next Dalai Lama.
Well, even if we're talking reincarnation, he can choose.
But it's to kind of avoid that the Chinese look for him.
Sorry?
To avoid that the Chinese look for their own Dalai Lama, like there's this possibility of the Dalai Lama now kind of choosing the next Dalai Lama while he's still alive, and apparently that's emanation, someone said to me. So
Well, that's if it's enlightenment, we wouldn't call it that. We'd call it this. Yes, correct,
okay.
correct.
Thinking about the idea of impermanence, the state of enlightenment would be impermanent?
Remember, impermanent doesn't mean it lasts a short time. Impermanent simply means, is this thing we're looking at changing from one moment to the next? So we can have impermanent things that last forever. Like, for example, our mind. The continuum of our mind has no beginning and no end. So our mind is impermanent and it lasts forever.
Can you explain emanation a bit?
Well, it just means that the person who's enlightened can appear in the world
As humans or
as humans, as
spirits or
everything. Everything is possible. Everything is possible.
How will he be different from other people around?
He won't be suffering. No suffering. To us, they may look exactly like a normal person. But for them, their experience is very different. They'll have no suffering.
Have you encountered any of them?
What we're going to see a little bit later, when we talk about a view of reality, is that technically, it's technically possible that in this room, I'm the only one who's not enlightened, that you're all enlightened pretending to be students to help me. So does an enlightened person have to walk around with a halo around their head? No. The enlightened person will appear in whatever form is helpful for others. So they may appear as a beggar. They may appear as a teacher. They may appear as a mother, as a friend. They may appear in many ways. So it's not like they're floating on air and halo around their head. In fact, if that happened in the modern world, probably they encounter a lot of hostility. Because they're some sort of freak. We'd think they're some sort of freak. If they didn't look like us, I mean, that's what we do in the modern world. It's tragic. This is what we do. If someone doesn't really look like us, then they're like, something wrong with them. And we really, I mean, it's true. It's true, I mean, that's tragic, but that's the reality.
If there's the death rebirth process, does it mean there's a finite number of beings?
So, remember the theory of conservation of consciousness means you can't have more or less. How many? That's another question, but we can't increase or decrease.
How can something be impermanent and still last forever? I can't.
Again, the word impermanent means changing. Literally the word means changing. Is it changing from one moment to the next? And the mind is changing from one moment to the next, but it didn't have a beginning and it won't have an end. Okay, let's go to this diagram now. Oh, one more thing before I go there. Any tradition that talks about something after this life has to really posit or say what is it that goes on. For example, in Christianity we talk about the soul going to heaven or hell. And some traditions at the time of the Buddha were talking about it's this Atman that goes from life to life and achieves liberation. So what's the Buddhist answer? What's the Buddhist assertion about what goes from life to life and achieves liberation? Actually, the question is a little bit loaded, because the question, what goes from life to life, is assuming there is a static entity that moves from this life to the next. So actually, to answer that, if we look at the physical world, there seems to be things going or moving through time. You know, this cup seems to be moving through time. But actually, if we look closely there, is there any static entity moving through time? No, there's just constant change, isn't there? I mean, science has proven that. There's nothing static there at all. But it seems like it. It seems like there's a thing there moving through time. But actually, all that is anywhere in the physical world is just a flow of change. So actually, even at the physical world level, there's not one single thing going or moving through time. Impossible. Similarly, the Buddhist assertion is, if we look at our mind superficially, it seems like our mind is moving through time. But if we look closely at our mind, like looking closely in the physical world, what we'll see is just a continuum of change unfolding. So we often talk about the continuum of mind. So actually, at the mental level, there's no thing moving through time. So then, technically speaking, what goes from this life to the next? The Buddhist answer is nothing, because nothing goes or moves through time. But if we leave aside the idea of some static entity moving through to the next life, if we just leave that idea out, there is an answer to that question, and that's going to come in a couple of days' time. So let's have a look now at this diagram. So this is called the Wheel of Life, or in Sanskrit, the Bhava Chakra. And what we see here is this wheel, symbolising samsara, is held by this monster called Yama. Yama is called the Lord of Death. And Yama is symbolising death and impermanence. And you see that Yama is biting the wheel. So that's symbolising the fact that we are trapped in the jaws of death, that we're trapped in this cycle of birth, aging, death, endlessly. So that's what Yama is symbolising, this cycling from birth, aging, death. But then we see outside the wheel, up the top right-hand corner, is the Buddha, meaning that he has transcended this cycle of birth, aging, death. He's transcended samsara. And he's pointing over to the other side, to the right. And in a more traditional diagram, in the right or the left for us, at the top, you'll find a moon in the sky. There's some writing and a round object on top. I'm not sure if that's supposed to be the moon, but often you'll see just the moon. And the moon is often used as a symbol for nirvana. Because the word nirvana of course, nirvana is a Sanskrit term, and nirvana we can divide into three parts. The nir prefix, like sam, means fully. Va here has two meanings, or can have two meanings. One means to cool. And the other meaning is to blow. And na, the suffix na, means the act of. So nirvana, the etymology is that it's the act of fully cooling or the act of fully blowing out. And we see both of those etymologies symbolized. The moon symbolizes the first one, the nirvana being the act of fully cooling. And the symbolism there is that now, just like the sun, the light of the sun torments us, it's heat, it torments us with heat. Likewise now, our mental afflictions torment us. We're tormented by the heat of the mental afflictions. But when we achieve nirvana, we've eliminated those mental afflictions. We're no longer tormented by them. Just like the light of the moon has a cooling effect, where the light of the sun is tormenting us, the heat of the sun. So in that sense, since we are fully cooled from the torment of the mental afflictions, we see the symbolism of the moon being nirvana. So that's the first etymology. And the second etymology we also see quite often, the nirvana means the act of fully blowing out, meaning that when we achieve nirvana, what's blown out, what's eliminated, and the symbolism is it's blown out like the flame of a candle, extinguished. And what's extinguished is our contaminated mind and this contaminated body. And this etymology you often see in a lot of the Theravada Buddhist traditions, that this idea of nirvana being like the blowing out of a candle. But here, in this diagram, we see the first etymology, the idea of cooling. And so we often see this moon in the sky there. I mean, there's a round object on the top, which could be the moon. But what we see here is some writing. And that writing there is teaching from the Buddha, who says, undertaking, I think this is a sort of Tibetan version of the diagram, so I think that's like Tibetan script. But the teaching there says, undertaking this and leaving that. Engage in the teaching of the Buddha. Like an elephant in a thatch house, destroy the domain of the Lord of Death. Those who with thorough attentiveness practice this dharma of subduing will eliminate the wheel of birth, bringing suffering to an end. Then if we go right to the middle of the diagram, we see three animals in the middle. These three animals are the three poisons, the three main mental afflictions that are the root of samsara. So that's why they're in the middle. And here we see a pig, a rooster, and a snake. The pig is symbolizing ignorance, the rooster is symbolizing attachment, the snake is symbolizing aversion. In this diagram, we see each animal is grabbing the tail of the next. In a more traditional diagram, you often see that the pig is grabbing both the tail of the rooster and the snake, symbolizing the fact that out of the mouth of ignorance comes attachment and aversion. But this is also okay because each one of those mental afflictions reinforces the others. So these three poisons are the three core mental afflictions, and that's what's driving our behaviour. And so that's the next section out, which we see divided into two halves. The left half is white, the right half is black. And that is symbolising what's called our virtuous and non-virtuous actions. So the white is symbolising the virtuous actions, and we see in that half the beings or people there are moving in an upward direction, meaning if we do good virtuous actions in this life, we will figuratively speaking move upward to a good future life. And on the right side, the black side, we see the beings there moving in a downward direction, meaning if we engage in harmful behaviour in this life, we will, figuratively speaking, move downward to a not such a good future existence. And then what types of existences are possible? Then we go to the next section out, which here we see divided into 5 sections. More traditionally, we see that divided into 6 sections. And this is what's called the 6 realms, the 6 types of existences that are possible. And so if we look at those, first we can go to between like 12 o'clock and 2 o'clock up the top here. So here we see some people with houses doing various activities and so forth. So this is symbolizing the human realm. And then if we go sort of from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock over to the side here, we see some animals, some birds, and then down the bottom I think there's supposed to be some fish down there. So that is symbolizing, of course, the animal realm. And then if we go up to sort of 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock up here, we see 2 groups of people, or beings. The upper half there are called the Deva realm. And in the Deva realm, the beings here have enormous sense pleasure and very little suffering. And so as a result, the word Deva is sometimes translated into English as God realm, but of course nothing to do with the idea of a creator God. God simply in meaning heavenly experiences, a lot of pleasure and hardly any suffering at all. And then the group that are slightly below that in the same section, this is called the Asura realm. And the beings here also have a lot of pleasure, live a long life, but don't have quite as much pleasure as the Devas. So sometimes the word Asura is translated as demigod, like half a god, half the pleasure. And what we see in this section, there's a tree in the middle. The base of the tree is in the Asura realm, but the top of the tree where all the fruit is in the Deva realm. So the sort of Asuras are sort of missing, that's symbolizing they're sort of missing out, that they're quite jealous. And that's why we see them firing arrows at the Devas, because there's a lot of jealousy in that Asura realm, because they're not got as much pleasure as the Devas. Then if we go from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock over here, we see some beings there, not looking like they're having a very good time at all, and some having flames coming out of their mouth, some big bellies and so forth. So this is symbolizing what's called the Preta realm. And in this realm, it's even difficult to have the basic necessities of life like food and drink and so forth. So sometimes because of that, this word Preta is sometimes translated into English as something like hungry spirit or hungry ghost realm. And then when we go down from sort of 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock, we see lots of flames and torture and so forth going on here. This is symbolizing what's called the Narak realm. And in this type of existence, there's a lot of suffering, particularly physical suffering. And because of that, sometimes this word Narak is translated as hell realm, but of course, not the same idea as the Christian idea of hell. So these are the 6 realms of existence. These are the 6 types of existence that are possible. Now, often the question then comes up, are these real, or are they merely some sort of psychological state in the human realm? So of course, with our direct experience, we can validate 2 of them, the human and animal realm. Some people claim to be able to see these other types of beings, so for them, they've got proof that they exist. Personally, I've never seen any of these other beings. But of course, what we can appreciate is that these sorts of existences is not some sort of abstract thing that we can't relate to, that certainly as a human, we have these types of experiences in our life. Sometimes we have enormous sensory pleasures, so we're really living like a deva or an asura. Sometimes we really sort of go down to the level of being like an animal. Sometimes, and you look in many places in the world, a lot of hunger and thirst and so forth. So a lot of people are having this type of existence, and of course you just have to go to the war-torn areas of the planet to see how many people are having immense physical suffering. But of course the assertion here is that these are actual types of existences. But to really appreciate these realms, in a correct way, we have to really appreciate the Buddhist theory, understanding of nature of reality. Because what we've already briefly said is that, according to Buddhism, there is no fixed, objective, independent world out there. The only world that exists is the world of our experience. So actually, when we really appreciate that, then there's not much difference between saying these are merely psychological states and actual existences. I mean, that's more or less saying the same thing. I mean, our human world is a psychological state. I mean, the only world is our world of experience. So, therefore, to be in one of these other realms is simply that our experience changes and maybe the body looks a bit different. So there's not like these Narak realms under the ground somewhere and these Deva realms somewhere else and we end up in the next life we end up getting stuffed in a dog's body or something. I mean, this is not a correct idea. I mean, what really happens, what we're going to really appreciate when we look at the Buddhist theory of reality, is the death rebirth. What happens is our perception shifts from this perception to something else. That's what it means. So these realms could all, I mean, of course, be right here. I mean, certainly the animal realm is right here, but there could be these beings right here now.
What is Shambhala?
Shambhala, that's tied in with what's called the Kala Chakra Tantra, and it's talking about a particular realm of existence, which is not really in any of those. Okay, one more point then on the realms. There's another presentation called the Three Realms. You sometimes see a presentation which talks about the formless realm, the form realm, and the desire realm. When we talk about desire realm, that's where we are now. So actually, all of these are in the desire realm. What's the form and formless realm is these are like higher planes of existence. Of course, still in samsara. These are not beyond samsara. How do we get there is through the shamatha practice. That if we develop higher and higher levels of concentration, then one of the effects of that is that we can then, because of that very high level of concentration, we can end up in these higher planes of existence in the next life. But again, these are simply temporary states that will end up dropping back down here. So then things like Shambhala and stuff are sort of said to be a little bit associated with one of these higher planes of existence.
Could you repeat the variant, which was?
In the diagram?
Yeah.
Yeah. So both the Deva and Asura realm in this diagram are in one, put together in one section, which is the one up here, from 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock. So we see two groups of people. The ones lower is the Asura, and the ones above is Deva.
And human realm? Which
Human
one?
realm was the one next to it, from 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock.
Okay, thank you.
And then we can ask, which one is the best realm? Which one's the best? To answer that, we'd have to say, by what criteria do you mean best? If you mean best, by best, most pleasure, least suffering, then of course the winner by far is the Deva realm. But if the criteria is, what is the best realm from which to escape samsara, the answer usually is human realm. Because in the Deva realm and Asura realm, there's too much pleasure, hardly any suffering, there's no motivation to do anything. We just hang out and enjoy. But of course the problem with that is, every time we're hanging out and enjoying, we're burning up imprints, good imprints. And we're not doing anything to replenish them, we're just burning them up. Every time we enjoy, more good stuff is burning up. And they have very long lives here, which means we burn up a lot of good imprints. And so the weight of the good imprints sort of goes, and then the negative imprints, because we've still got some negative imprints, but then at the end of the life, the weight of the negative is more than the positive, because we have not done either negative or positive, we've just enjoyed. And so then, usually what it's said is at the end of these very long lives, burning up so much good imprints, they end up down here somewhere. And then, of course, the animal, preta and narak realm generally have too much suffering and not enough cognitive ability to do anything. So, human realm has generally enough good conditions, but enough suffering to understand this is not the final solution, and enough cognitive ability to do something about it. So the human realm has the good mix of those three things, from which we can then exit samsara. And of course, in Buddhist cosmology, is that this planet is not the only place with life or with sentient beings. There is multiple planets with life and multiple universes. So if this planet was suddenly to disintegrate, then we'd all end up in some other place.
How can we help animals, like, get to a better realm?
If we think about this, it seems like it's almost impossible for these beings to get up here, but actually that's not true, because the reverse of this can happen, is that if they're down here, they're experiencing a lot of suffering, then every time they're burning up negative imprints. Which means if they, particularly naraks, have a long life of suffering, but then they've burnt up a lot of negative imprints, so the balance scale shifts again, and then they can end up coming back here. So similarly with animal and preta realm.
Is it like goes from the worst to the best one right now? From the 6th to the first one?
So this is listed in this order, generally in terms of suffering versus pleasure.
So it's better.
Most suffering, less, least. But of course, within each one of those, there's a lot of variations. Because even in the human realm, we can see there's a lot of variation. I mean, some people have enormous pleasure, some people have a lot of suffering. So, as a generalization, that would be the case. That's why they're listed in that order, from most suffering to least suffering.
So by narak, it's not about poor human beings.
No.
It's just, okay.
Yeah, this is a different type of existence.
Okay.
Okay. So then, of course, often the question is, oh, well, how do we account for increase of human population? Well, that's easy. It just means beings from these realms are moving into the human realm. And if the human realm population decrease, means they're going to other realms. So that's easy to explain. And then the last question is how to reach the human realm. So what we can see is if we're down here, not easy. And up here, also not easy because we end up sort of going here. But what it does mean is that now that we're actually in the human realm, we can go a long way to ensuring that we continue to have such an existence in the future. And that is, of course, ethical lifestyle. That if we really have an ethical lifestyle, we really try to avoid harmful behaviour and in addition try to help others, that will go a long way towards ensuring that we continue to come back as a human in the next lives. So that is the basis.
What is the meaning of burning out imprints?
Burning out imprints. Oh, so remember in this, every time we do an action, that has an imprint in our mind, and that ripens as an experience. So when it ripens as an experience, the imprint is finished. Like the seed becomes the plant, there's no longer a seed. So when we have that imprint and it ripens as some sort of experience, then the imprint is finished.
So the theory you just said before, does it mean that the world will get better and better? Like with people with better behavior?
Well, no, it depends what we do.
Because you said that there is conservation of the
Consciousness, yeah, right.
and
So if we all start behaving badly, this is going to end badly, isn't it? As we can see in the world today, unfortunately.
No, but doesn't it mean that we will get to the other realms based on the karma?
So your question is if we do good things, we're going to end up here?
The question is, does it mean the theory you just explained before, does it mean that the world will get more and more people with good behavior?
Well, that
Because
depends.
there is this conservation.
But why does that imply we're going to behave better and better? I don't see the connection there. Conservation of consciousness just means you can't create it, you can't destroy it.
Yes, it means only good ones can stay as humans.
No, but I mean in the human realm people do good things and bad things, but I think that's not the question. I'm not sure. Okay. Right down the back.
It does logically make sense that eventually people will get better and better, more people will achieve Buddhahood over an infinite period of time. I think this is your point. I don't know. As if I understand correctly, eventually people get better and better and go up the world, and eventually.
But why would that be the case?
Well, because you can do good or bad, and even on a random probability whether you do good or bad each life, eventually you would get to the top over an infinite period of lives.
Why?
Because that's how mathematics works. Your option is 50% probability that you do good, 50% probability you do bad, and that over an infinite period of lives.
But the difference here is when you get to the top of the pile, you don't keep doing any good, and you end up at the bottom of the pile.
Because you're not eventually do good at it.
No, you go up that way, you'll never get to build up. This is not the way to enlightenment.
Okay, is there a way then that, statistically speaking, like somehow you might reach enlightenment?
Might.
Yeah. And then if over an infinite period of lives,
right,
then surely there's a tiny percentage chance of each life you reach enlightenment, then eventually you would reach enlightenment, and therefore over the infinite time period, which is what I think.
Right, but again, this is assuming linear time.
No, I'm assuming infinite time.
Right, but we're still assuming time.
Okay, I'm assuming like an infinite series of events.
Right.
Maybe I've got it wrong now. It doesn't. That does seem to make sense that eventually we'll all reach Buddhahood.
Yeah, but again, it's not the same as in. Again, we're not talking about a physical system, a closed system.
Okay, so it's.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about the mind, so it's a bit different than a physical system where maybe this mathematically would have the logical conclusion.
I'm probably being difficult, sorry.
Probably they mean when in Deva you are your weight of all good deeds are getting burned up, so you will get to, and your weight of bad deeds now weigh more, so you are going to Naraka. And in Naraka you are burning your bad acts, so probably they mean after infinite time your bad deeds and good deeds, they are all burned up. So
No, they're not all burned up. I mean, even beings in these realms do some actions. I mean, they're not doing nothing. They're not doing nothing.
Just a question about the diagram. So Lord Yama looks like he has a third eye.
Right.
And he's also got a lotus on the top of his head, which in yoga is the crown chakra.
Well, these 5 skulls are symbolizing the impermanence of the 5 aggregates, and the eye in the middle is symbolizing impermanence.
Okay, so it's not the same meaning as like wisdom, knowledge.
Well, wisdom in terms of understanding impermanence. So that eye in the middle is the wisdom of impermanence, understanding impermanence, and the 5 skulls is symbolizing the impermanence of the 5 aggregates, which is basically the body and the mind.
And the little lotus flower?
Which lotus flower?
Just above the eye and below the first skull.
Lotus flower?
Yeah.
I can see flames.
The central skull.
Huh? Oh, the central skull? Oh, the lotus there. I don't know.
the first one.
Probably. I mean, everything you find in Tibetan Buddhism, everything has symbolism, but I don't know. I don't know. I mean, sometimes lotus is symbolizing compassion, but I don't think that's the case here.
In which realms can we achieve enlightenment?
From which realms? Well, again, it's saying that the human realm is by far the best, but technically the other realms are possible, but very difficult. Very difficult.
And what about the tiger?
Sorry?
The tiger?
That's a tiger skin. Again, I think I seem to remember some description of it meaning, what was it? I think it was to do with fear. Fear. I think it was symbolizing fear, if I remember rightly.
In terms of rebirth, can we be born in different levels and different levels of
Yeah, even within every realm there are many levels.
But would that be in terms of your karma and the imprints you're taking from those other realms?
Well, yeah, you carry forward. I need to do one more presentation. We're running out of time, then maybe some more questions.
So this outermost circle.
Yeah, that's what the presentation we need to do now. So, and this is a very important presentation. So then let's go to the outer circle. And this outer circle has 12 diagrams in it. These are called the 12 links of dependent origination. Or for short term, they call the 12 links. And these 12 links, again, describe the process of how we're cycling life after life due to our mental afflictions and actions. So let's have a look at those. So if we go up to 1 o'clock here, we see a person holding a stick. So that's a blind person. And that blind person is symbolizing ignorance, meaning we are blinded by our ignorance, and because of that we end up doing actions based on ignorance and mental afflictions. So that is the second link here, which is symbolized by a person on a potter's wheel forming a clay pot. And that symbolizes the fact that the actions we do now is literally forming what our future is going to look like, just like the potter is forming a pot. And every action we do, of course, leaves an imprint on the mind, and so that is symbolized by the third link here, consciousness, and that is symbolized here by a monkey in front of a house. So the house has 5 windows and a door. They are our 5 sense faculties, and the door is the mental faculty. And the monkey is jumping from one window to the other, and that's really symbolising the fact we often hear this expression, crazy monkey mind. That our mind is jumping from one sense faculty to another, to the mental faculty. It's out of control. And so that is the symbolising consciousness, the third link. And then, as I briefly mentioned earlier, one of these imprints that we are imprinted on the mind will then later ripen as the next life. And the next life begins at the point where, and we'll use here the example of a human life, where the mind conjoins with the fertilised egg in the womb. So that is symbolised by link 4, called name and form. And that is, the symbolism here is we have a boat with some people in it. The boat is symbolising the body. The people is symbolising the mind. So the body is the vessel for the mind. So that's symbolising again when the mind conjoins with the fertilised egg in the womb. We have the boat of the body now, and the mind is on that basis. And then, of course, the embryo and fetus develop in the womb. And at some point of that development, the sense faculties become operational. So that is the next link, the 6 sense spheres. So that's link number 5. And that is again symbolised by a house with 5 windows and a door. The 5 windows are the 5 sense faculties. The door is the mental faculty. And so when our faculties become operational, they contact their respective objects. So that is link number 6, contact. And that's quite graphically represented here by a couple making love. So there's a lot of contact happening there. And so when we contact an object, then from that arises feeling. So we experience that object as either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So that is link number 7 here of feeling. And that is also quite graphically represented here by a person with an arrow stuck in their eye. So there's a lot of feeling going on there. And what we saw earlier from feeling, if it's pleasant feeling, we end up with craving and attachment. If it's unpleasant feeling, we end up with aversion and so forth. So that is link number 8 and 9, is craving and grasping. And this craving and grasping arising from feeling is a very specific craving and grasping. It's the craving and grasping that occurs at the time of death. That we are literally craving and grasping to life itself. So here craving, link 8, is symbolised by a person holding some alcohol, so they're craving alcohol. And then link 9, grasping, is symbolised here by a monkey grasping fruit from a tree. So the difference between craving and grasping is that first we crave something, and then grasping is actually trying to get it. So in the death process, we feel like we're going out of existence, so we're craving life, and then we grasp to life itself. And that grasping to life itself, like grasping the fruit, activates an imprint in our mind. And that activated imprint is link number 10, called becoming. And that activated imprint here is symbolised by a pregnant woman who's about to give birth. So that imprint that's activated is about to give birth to the new life. And then, of course, the birth of the new life is next. So that's link number 11, called birth. And that's symbolised by a woman actually giving birth. And then what follows birth, of course, is ageing and death, which is link number 12. And that's symbolised here by an old person carrying a corpse on their back. So what we can see here is that we are stuck in this cycle of birth, aging, death if we go right back to the beginning to link 1, due to ignorance, due to our grasping to independent me, independent world. So these 12 links highlights how we are stuck in samsara due to our distorted view and our mental afflictions. But it highlights how to break free of it. So how to go beyond link 12 is to go beyond to link 11. We go back to link 1, and we can understand if we get rid of ignorance, we'll get rid of link 2, 3, and so forth up to birth, aging and death. So therefore, it's really showing to us how to transcend samsara by eliminating this fundamental ignorance through this vipassana practice of emptiness to come to realise nature of reality. So, what is the history of this diagram? Is that at the time of the Buddha, one of the places that he spent a lot of time after he achieved enlightenment, there was a place called Rajgir. A lot of these perfection of wisdom teachings that we'll be using as a basis for our emptiness presentation day after tomorrow, he taught there. Rajgir means the place of the king. So the king of the region was living in Rajgir, and he was a disciple of the Buddha, and his name was King Bimbisara, and so sometimes you see him come up in some of the sutras, the discourses of the Buddha, his name is mentioned. And it said that one day he received a precious gift from a neighbouring king, and he wanted to give back something of equal value to this king, but he didn't have anything. So he went to the Buddha and he said, what shall I give back that was of equal value to what I received? And it said that the Buddha commissioned the drawing of this diagram, and then he gave this to the other king, who reflected on, studied, meditated on it, and as a result of that, that king achieved liberation, achieved nirvana. So maybe it's sort of useful, this diagram. Personally, I really find this diagram very helpful, particularly these 12 links, to really show or highlight how we are stuck in this cycle of existence, but also how to break free of it. There's a lot more to be said about this diagram, but I think that's enough for now. So if there's any questions, we've still got a bit of time left.
When we talk about the 6 grounds, that we don't, well, you said that maybe they don't exist elsewhere, but...
well, they could, but they could be right here as well.
They could be right here. If they're right here, then they will be all in human forms.
Why?
No?
Animals are not in human form, but they're right here.
For example, Preta or other demons.
Yeah. So these types of beings have very subtle bodies, sort of bodies of light. Some people claim to be able to see them, so they could be right here. And it's often said that actually pretas, or some pretas, like living in like trees, like the tree is their home. And so you often find in Tibetan culture they don't like to cut down trees because they could be cutting down someone's home. And actually I've got a story about that. I mentioned earlier I did this meditation retreat years ago in Spain, and it was a retreat centre with lots of cabins, and I was there for 8 months. And I remember that there was a cabin not far around the side of the mountain a bit. I could sort of see it a bit, but the whole time I was there I never saw anyone there, and it looked like a very nice cabin. So and it was quite busy, the place, so I thought, that's odd that there's no one been there for the whole 8 months. So at the end of my retreat I went to the centre and asked, well, why don't you use this cabin? They said, what happened was the previous year, outside the cabin was an old tree stump, and they decided to knock it down and get it out of the way. And then after that time, a number of people who were meditating in there had a lot of problems. Like one person felt that when they were sleeping, something was pressing on their chest. Another person was saying that when they're in the shower, they felt like they were being attacked. Another person really had quite a strong mental problem, something trying to attack them. And so over a period of a year, there was 8 or 10 people who had very strong, serious problems in there. And then they sort of found out that actually someone came who had some ability to see these beings and really discovered that actually what had happened was there was a preta living in this tree stump, and when it got knocked down, he got upset. And so anyone who was coming into the house, he was trying to attack them. Some people who were there didn't have any problems. In fact, a friend of mine during that time did a short retreat there, and she said she didn't have any problems. So I think it depends on the state of your mind whether they can have some effect on you. But certainly many people over that period had a lot of serious problems. And so then from that point they stopped using that. But then I heard later someone came and they managed to sort of pacify this preta and, get him to move on. And so now they're using the hut again. So that's the story.
So they would be like the spirits or the...
Well, again, spirits, you could use the word spirit for any of these types of beings. It depends what you mean by the word spirit. And even, as we said earlier, when we go into this intermediate state, this bardo state, you could call that a spirit. It's just a word.
Which of those realms would generate compassion?
Probably the human realm is the best. I think this would be difficult because there's not really any suffering there, so no compassion for what? Everything's good. And down here, I think certainly animals, I think we can see that some animals are very compassionate to, particularly their young and so forth, they really care for them and so forth. Down here, probably here, I think if they have some cognitive ability, because there's a lot of suffering, I think possible for compassion here, depending on level of cognitive ability, how much suffering.
Population is increasing so much over the years, right? So from the Buddhist perspective, where are all those minds coming from? If they were never created, something.
They're just coming from other realms. And when we go into looking at the number of beings in these realms, we're talking huge numbers, like big numbers. Even forget about these. The number of animals versus humans is like, the ratio is like astronomical.
You said before, even if it's difficult, you can reach lightning from other realms, not only from humans.
Well, technically possible, but very unlikely.
Okay. Even if it's very unlikely, sorry about this question. Do you, from the Buddhist perspective, animals know all this theory? So, yeah.
Some animals, of course, it's obvious they have very limited cognitive ability, but maybe there's some others that have even more cognitive ability than us. Maybe, I don't know.
What does Buddhism say about this?
Well, if you have cognitive ability, then of course we can work things out. So it's a matter of what level of cognitive ability we have.
My question is that maybe it can explain that why the characters are different in some animals. Do you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, sure. Same characters in people are different. So I think also in animals are different. It wasn't so long ago where most people thought animals don't even have feelings. And that's still actually prevalent in a lot of society, unfortunately, in a lot of society, that animals don't have feelings, so we can kill them, no problem.
What determines which realm to be good?
Again, now, what we do with our life. If we do a lot of harmful behaviour, we'll end up down here somewhere. If we do a lot of good, we'll end up here. If we have we do good, but with a motivation, we want a lot of pleasure, then we may end up here. But if we do good just for the sake of helping people, then we'll continue to be in a human realm.
So if we kind of want to be in the human realm to have the best conditions to reach enlightenment or work towards that, why would we ever get to Deva level, for example? How would that happen?
How would it happen is that our motivation is we want pleasure, but we're still doing good things. If you're wanting pleasure, you're doing bad things, you're going to end up down here.
But we see human and animals exist. We don't know whether Deva or Asura exist now.
Sure. But some people claim that they can see them in their direct experience. I mean, I haven't, but a number of people have. And the Buddhist assertion is that if we develop our concentration, we can perceive these beings directly as well.
I mean, in a certain sense of my question, would you have to have a higher level of consciousness to see those other beings?
I mean, they say sometimes that, like, people naturally have that ability, and often the explanation is because in the past life they've done something that's now ripening as that ability. But generally, to newly have that ability to perceive these beings, the way to do that is just to purify the mind through the shamatha and vipassana practice. If we purify the mind, the capacity of the mind increases, and due to that we can start to see these more subtle types of beings and subtle everything, in fact.
Did you say there's a set number of beings always? What's that number?
Very big. Very big. Yeah.
What were the 5 skulls again on the picture?
The 5 skulls are what's called the 5 aggregates. 5 aggregates is one way of describing the basis of a person. And what's called the form aggregate is the body, and the other 4 together is the mind. So it's basically saying that these 5 skulls are symbolizing impermanence of body and mind.
Is there something specific for Tibetan Buddhism, or?
No, this was, remember, from the time of the Buddha, this diagram.
So if you don't decide to go through the elimination after being enlightened, where?
What we're going to see tomorrow is that the whole purpose of achieving enlightenment is to benefit others. So it's not like we achieve enlightenment and we go, I think I'm just going to have a holiday. I mean, that idea wouldn't enter your head.
But like, you could decide which realm you go into?
Yeah, sure. Last question, yeah.
You say that mind takes a rebirth, mind. So, is it a Western interpretation of, as per the Hinduism and the Buddhism, they believe that soul takes the rebirth, not the mind. Mind is the pure intellect. It is the pure conscious intellect, whereas soul is the thread. The mind and soul goes together.
So
it is something like, in my understanding, like mind is like a bulb, electric bulb, whereas the soul is like a switch. Unless you switch on, the bulb will not light.
Well, generally in Buddhism we don't see the word soul at all. It's not mentioned anywhere. And we'll have a look at, when we look at the Buddhist view of reality day after tomorrow, we'll have a look at what is the Buddhist assertion of what goes from life to life. So that will be answered day after tomorrow. So there's a whole lot of other discussion we need to precede that for it to make sense, but that will definitely come. So we've run out of time there, so let's leave it there. So tomorrow, so now we've covered the first 2 Noble Truths in some detail. So tomorrow we're going to go on to the 3rd and 4th Noble Truth, the truth of cessation and the truth of path leading to the cessation. So for that, we're going to cover page 9, 10, 11 and 12. So page 9, 10, 11 and 12. And also we're going to cover on page 14 what's called the 6 perfections. This presentation called the 6 perfections on page 14 and 15, so we're going to cover that as well. And also we're going to look at your other chart here tomorrow, the 3 vehicles chart. So we're going to look at that as well tomorrow. So that's the subject matter, page 9 to 12. The 6 perfections presentation on page 14 and this 3 vehicles chart. So now, this afternoon with Felipe, the meditation will be like yesterday. Today will be how to deal with anger, some ways of dealing with anger. This evening's meditation, you're going to do this purification practice, these 4 opponent powers, packaged in a certain way. And then tomorrow morning, continuing that shamatha practice observing the mind. You'll also do that a little bit this evening as well. Shamatha practice observing the mind, and also then before breakfast a little bit of compassion practice as well. So that's the meditations for the next 3 sessions. So let's take a break there. Come back at 5:30 and I'll again see you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock.